I'm Aidan O'D, a master's student of Digital Experience Design at Hyper Island, and in this video I will discuss reframing as an active synthesis as it relates to human-centered design. The history of human-centered design can be found in the participatory design movements in Scandinavia in the 1960s and 70s, particularly Christian Nygaard and his work on the social impact of computer technology. From there to user-centered design, a term coined by Don Norman in his book The Design of Everyday Things. Other paradigms in the evolution of human-centered design are meta-design and service design, as illustrated by ithinkidesign.com. However, I wish to touch on Mike Cooley, who first developed the term human-centered design. IDEO, a thought leader in human-centered design and design thinking, blurs the boundaries between the two. Their CEO, Tim Brown, describes design thinking as a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. There are other thought leaders in this space, each with their own version of a human-centered design or design thinking process. The commonalities are quite interesting to consider. Each seem to have a three-part process with some act of creation, design, or synthesis to bridge. John Kolko, founder of Austin Center for Design's particular model, resonates strongest with me in the context of human-centered design. He poses the three headings of ethnography, synthesis, and prototyping. The bridge from understanding what people need to the delivery of a solution is the process of synthesis. According to Kolko, design synthesis is an abductive sense-making process of manipulating, organizing, pruning, and filtering data in an effort to produce information and knowledge. Charles Owen expresses similar thoughts when he said, makers are driven to synthesize what they know in new constructions, arrangements, patterns, compositions, and concepts that bring tangible, fresh expressions of what can be. The complexity of this process is somewhat underplayed by McCrory, Wilkinson, and Frink when, in 1963, they said the designer can fulfill his synthesis function by an orderly procedure. In order to understand where reframing sits in the overall architecture of synthesis, it is important to introduce the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom model. This model describes a progression from data to wisdom. Kolko uses this to situate certain methods of synthesis. In order to progress, the designer must cross what Kolko calls chasms. Each chasm brings with it certain tasks, objectives, and methods. Chasm 1 is make meaning out of the data. Chasm 2 is experience frameworking. And chasm 3 is gaining empathy. The purpose of this chasm is to consider provocations and really understand the end user. It is here where reframing sits. A frame, as Keith Dorst describes, is a general implication that by applying a certain working principle, we will create a specific value. Similarly, Sean described framing as the creation of a novel standpoint from which a problematic situation can be tackled. However, Klein, Moon, and Hoffman warned that even though frames define what count as data, they themselves actually shape the data. According to Kolko, reframing is a way of shifting semantic perspective in order to view things in a new way. It is used to re-embed a product, system, or service in a new and not necessarily logical context in order to identify implications and insights. I'll borrow an example from Kolko when he describes reframing. Consider a toothbrush. We can think about a toothbrush from three perspectives: the environment, the user, or the embodiment. From the perspective of the environment, we might ask, what is a toothbrush specifically designed for the kitchen, or for a conference, or for an airplane? What does it look like? How is it used? What is it made out of? From the perspective of the user, normally we consider the toothbrush from the consumer point of view. But consider it from the dentist's point of view. When mapped to IDEO's Radical Innovation Matrix, introduced to us by Hyper Island industry leader Lydia Howland, and discussed in the IDEO HCD report, these frames get us to evolutionary innovation. In order to get to radical innovation, I propose looking at Keyes-Dorst's equation for framing. What you are designing plus how the end user will use that design results in a desired outcome. Dorst defines a frame as the how and the outcome. In both instances of the environment and the user, we are changing the design of a toothbrush, but we are not fundamentally questioning if the toothbrush is the correct thing to design. In order to create radical innovation, I propose questioning the what part of the equation. Should we be making a toothbrush at all? This type of process is called design abduction. I won't talk at length on this topic, but at a high level, design abduction is when only the desired outcome is known. You do not know what it is you should make or how the end user might use it. Kolko helps us to work through design abduction using the embodiment perspective. With this perspective, consider if a toothbrush was a spray or a service or an experience. Is that even possible? How would that work? The toothbrush is now not the primary focus, rather the primary user goal, or as Dorst would call it, the outcome. There are design implications for what you design and how the person ultimately uses that design. If you question both of those and focus solely on the intended outcome, this opens up new users as well as entirely new offerings. Embodiment reframing places new designs in the radical innovation space. I will now talk about how to reframe as a team. Standing in a horseshoe facing the wall, give each participant a marker and post-its and explain the task. We are reframing the design problem. This is about ideating new and interesting ways to view the problem. Divide the wall into 3 sections, which are your 3 different perspectives: environment, user, and embodiments. Along the left of the perspective, create a frame column. The first task is to free associate different frames. Pose questions like, what if it is for X type of users? What if it was in Y environment? Or, what if the product was at Z? Encourage the yes and system. Participants should build on ideas and suspend criticism. As de Bono says when talking about movement, we are solely interested in where we can move to from the idea. We seek to move forward. Next, participants need to fill out the primary user goals for each new frame created. This is an incredibly important part of the process, as it requires empathy for the end user. Encourage the participants to generate credible stories. A way of beginning this storytelling process is to say, if the frame is X and I am this type of person, then I would like to achieve Y. Introduce the technique of yes but as a way of encouraging participants to discuss why certain user goals would be useful. This should only be in relation to the primary goal column. Capture some of the more interesting discussion points and put them in a car park to be discussed again. Then, participants need to start filling out the implications and insights column. Criticism is completely suspended again for this stage, and encourage more than one implication or insight for each frame. The aim is to generate 50 insights or implications per perspective. Next, the implications and insights that are most relevant to the initial design project should be selected. This selection process should take about an hour. Dotmocracy is a good initial technique to employ. It is a technique for selecting ideas that I have used in Hyper myself. It promotes conversation, debate, and democracy of ideas. In considering the behavioural psychology behind framing, I've highlighted 2 potential cognitive biases from the illustration compiled by Buster Benson, introduced to us by Hyper Island industry leader Kate Kerr, that could affect design work. Grant Iverson spoke of the clustering illusion when he talked about the tendency to overestimate the importance of small runs, streaks, or clusters in large samples of random data. As post-node clustering can be used as an alternative to dotmocracy to select the most valuable insights and implications, the team must remain cognizant that clustering illusion might happen. David Leibson spoke of hyperbolic discounting when he described it as the tendency for people to have a stronger preference for more immediate payoffs relative to later payoffs. The facilitator should be aware of this particular bias and interject when she sees fit. In this video, I've contextualized reframing in the human-centered design process. I've described what reframing is, how to do it in a team, how to achieve radical innovation with it, and how it could impact your team from a behavioral psychology standpoint.